There is grandeur in this view of life.
Welcome to Evolution Talk with Rick Coast, an introduction to the oldest story ever told.
Received wisdom, even to the present day, I think, is one which, in fact, I was also in favor of when I was beginning to complete the first stage of my work on the Burgess Shale. And to an effect was taken forward by Stephen Jay Gould, who, of course, most of you will know, as a very distinguished professor in Harvard, now unfortunately deceased. But he put forward this famous quote about rerunning the tape of life. I mean, if we were to go back to the Cambrian, or whenever you prefer, and start the whole merry process off again, then the likelihood of anything like ourselves evolving was surely vanishingly low.
That was evolutionary biologist Simon Conway Morris, famous for his work in studying the fossils of the Burgess Shale. In that audio clip, he mentions a famous comment, or even you could say a thought experiment, made by Stephen Jay Gould about replaying the tape of life. Gould said that were we to have the uncanny ability to replay the tape of life, and were to do so 1,000 times, or even 1,000,000 times over, we may never see anything like us evolve again. That is to say, the species you and I belong to, the Homo sapien species, may never appear again. Now, that is a sobering thought with many implications. The first being that we are lucky to be here at all. This one time the tape of life was played, we happened to be here. For all we know, it had been played out 1,000,000 times over before us. We are one of trillions of results in an evolving universe that began 13.7 billion years ago with the Big Bang. It could be a universe in a series of Big Bangs, which bounce back under the force of gravity into a big crunch, which bangs again. At least physicists have offered that as one of the many different scenarios based on observing the current state of our universe. But that's the world of physics. It's a subject I find fascinating, but not the topic of today. We're here to talk about evolution, specifically the evolution of man, or whether or not we represent an inevitable evolutionary step in the process. So let's go back to what evolution by natural selection is. It's a process by which random mutations in the replication of genes either provide a benefit or a disadvantage to the organism those genes produce. If the variation provides an advantage to that organism, given the environmental pressures it faces, then that variation will persist. If that organism has offspring and that variation is inheritable, the chances are high they will inherit the gene. Now, it's not 100% certainty that they will. The copying process is amazing, but it's not perfect. If, on the other hand, that gene mutation presented a disadvantage, there's a good chance the organism may not live long enough to reproduce, and the variation will disappear. In a nutshell, take all of these slight random gene mutations, bundle them all up over time, a vast amount of time, and you have a new species. Take two groups of individuals of the same species, separate them, give them 1,000,000,000 years to collect those mutations, and you will see two species that no longer have the ability to breed. They may look nothing like the original species did at the time they were separated, otherwise known as their common ancestor. The environmental pressure placed on the two separated groups may even have been exactly the same, and you would still see differences. Put them in entirely different environments, and natural selection will produce organisms which bear no resemblance to their ancient ancestors, or the other extant group had it survived. So, back to the question or Gould's thought experiment. What about humanity? If we replayed everything again, exactly as it occurred from the moment of the Big Bang, would I be talking to you right now? Now, this leads me to a conundrum. I'm an admitted materialist. If every little thing, every particle, was in exactly the same spot and moving in the same direction at the moment we began the replay, then I would argue that, yes, we would be here. But it would all have to be exactly the same, without one thing being different, even at a quantum level. Again, I'm dipping my toe into the world of physics. You can't subvert the laws of physics to get different results. So let's forget physics for a moment. Replay the tape over, change one little thing, and given enough time, that one little change, if it proved advantageous, will couple with another random change, and those changes will accumulate. Perhaps life never evolves. Perhaps it does and takes an entirely different direction. Maybe it never even happens here on Earth, but instead happens elsewhere on a planet with slightly different gravity. What evolves there may not be like anything we have ever seen. There may be similarities, but it doesn't necessarily have to be so. It's kind of spooky. Let's look at this another way. Chance doesn't have to take the form of a random genetic mutation for everything to have evolved differently.
One of the principal ways of redirecting the course of evolution is through the agency of mass extinctions. And you can identify many, 5 big ones. And here, the idea more or less is that the ecological slate is pretty well wiped clean, and a lot of shocked survivors covered with dust and generally looking pretty depressed stagger back into the dim sunlight, and off they go in a completely new direction. And so Gould in particular emphasized that, for example, at the end of the Cretaceous, about 66 million years ago, if the asteroid had not impacted a location on the edge of the Caribbean, then the dinosaurs would not have gone extinct, and therefore the mammals would, of course, never seize their opportunity to evolve into things like bats and whales and, oh, by the way, primates.
Again, that was Simon Conway Morris. If the asteroid had never hit, things would be entirely different here on our little planet. It's tempting to step back into the world of physics again and claim that it was going to hit Earth no matter how many times you replay it, all physical laws being equal, but we can't know that. What we can know is that any number of things can happen to change the course of, well, everything. In 1970, British mathematician John Conway created a computer game called The Game of Life. It still exists today, though it's in different programming languages and is simply called Life, or Life 32. I won't get into the rules coded into the game, but it basically represents, or it's basically presented as, a grid of squares. Each grid is either filled with a color, or it is not. In other words, it's turned on, which meaning it's filled, or it's off, meaning it's empty. When a few squares are pre-populated at the beginning of the game and it's left to run, many different things will happen. Shapes will evolve, some will actually disappear or go extinct, and others might persist and populate or replicate. If you use the same set of pre-filled squares at the beginning, it will always play out the same. It's a deterministic world based on the rules. You can theoretically replace these rules with the laws of physics. If you change a couple of squares at the start of the game, you will achieve a different outcome. It doesn't change the deterministic nature of the game, though. So, how does evolution and random chance fit in, if John Conway's life game is taken at face value? I'll let American philosopher Daniel Dennett take the stage here. This is from a lecture he gave for the Skeptics Society Distinguished Lecture Series.
It is possible to create things in the life world which can take some steps to protect themselves, that can move out of harm's way. Now, of course, in order to be able to do this, they have to be able to anticipate harm coming. Now, either this is because their godlike designers have pre-designed them to be particularly adept at getting out of certain kinds of harm's way, or they maybe even have to have some way of learning in their own lifetimes within the life world what steps to take to avoid certain kinds of harm. In other words, it is quite possible to design avoiders in the life world, and then we can ask such questions as, well, if you run this life world, some vast assemblage on the plane, if you run this life world for 1 trillion generations, for 1 trillion instants, what will be left at the end? And you can say, well, the harm avoiders are going to do better than those that can't avoid harm. They're the ones that are going to have a better chance of survival. And so in this way, an evolutionary process can go on in the life plane in spite of the fact that it's a deterministic world. Some of the avoiders are going to be better at avoiding harm than others, and they're the ones that are going to survive, and if they can replicate, they can make even better avoiders, and so forth and so on, just the way it's happened in 3 dimensions in a somewhat more complicated physics on this planet and presumably on many others.
Now, to be honest, it's shaky ground to plant one's flag, but I understand what Professor Dennett is trying to convey. In the parameters of the game, those forms that manage to avoid harm are the ones left standing, the avoiders. But I'd argue it still remains in the parameters and rules of the game. It is still governed by rules. Even if you were to program a random number generator to control the squares, it's still programmed. Professor Gould would argue that it would never turn out the same, or that it was highly unlikely life on Earth would include Homo sapiens. Random mutation would have taken a different path.
Every particular state of the life world has exactly one future, which it's whatever it is, and if you put the life world into that state, that's the state it'll go into every time. That's because it's a deterministic world. How many worlds are there? How many life worlds are there? Well, it depends on how big a screen you have, but it's in my technical sense, it's a vast number. It's not an infinite number, but it's an unbelievably large number of different possible worlds. Here, we can use the phrase possible worlds and mean something very precise and clean about it. There's all these different ways of having states in the life world. Now, it's interesting that some of these life worlds are just junk, they're just chaotic, nothing interesting happens in them. And in fact, all but a tiny, tiny fraction of the possible life worlds are just junk. They don't differ, the junky ones, from the ones that are interesting in that they're deterministic and the others aren't. They're all deterministic. But in some of them, avoiders evolve. And, wonder of wonders, that's the kind of world we live in. We live in a world in which avoiders have evolved. We didn't have to. There were all sorts of other possible universes that wouldn't have had avoiders. But our world has avoiders, and we are them.
So what do you think? If I handed you the remote and gave you the ability to watch it all from the very beginning, what do you think would happen? I hope you enjoyed today's episode of Evolution Talk. I'm Rick Coast, and you can find show notes and source material used for this episode at evolutiontalk.com. I'd love to hear from you. If you have any questions or even want to comment on the episode, you can reach me at rick@coastmedia.com. I hope your week is going well, and until next time, please take care of yourself.
Evolution Talk is a Rick Coast production.